Welcome to Simply the Truth. This is Thursday, the 1st of September, and this is Simply the Truth live with me, Doug Harris. Thank you for joining us, because you are as important as those of us here in the studio. And in the studio with me tonight is Dr. Adam Bradford. Thank you, Adam, for joining us.
Good evening.
We've had sessions before on an In Conversation. I was so intrigued by what you were saying that I said we just got to get you to talk a little more about it. So that's what we're doing here tonight. And basically we're talking about your book, first of all, The Jesus Discovery. The Jesus Discovery, and it says, another look at Christ's missing years. Now, we're going to unpack some of that and find out some of the things you've been thinking about. But, I mean, just tell us briefly about yourself, because you were brought up in the Jewish faith.
Yes, my family's.
When did you come to know Christ as your Messiah? And so tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, right when I shouldn't have done. When I was 12 years old, I was evangelized by table tennis through a Church of England youth group. I thought I was going to play table tennis. I did indeed play table tennis, and I was invited back the next day, which was Sunday. Took my table tennis mat with me and found out it was some type of Bible study. So I thought, okay, well, let's see what they've got to say. Jesus is a taboo person in my background, but when you're a teenager or a nearly teenager, you know, taboo things are interesting. So I was interested. Right.
And were you able to receive him straight away, or did it take a while for that to come through?
No, it was a little while. I went on a cruise, a canal cruise, with the Crusader movement on the Norfolk canals, the Norfolk Broads, and we had some Bible studies in the evening, and it was explained that, look, you can experience this for yourself. It isn't just something that you can understand. You can also know it and experience it. I was encouraged to pray, and I prayed, and God became real in my life through somebody who I came to know as Messiah, or Christ, his son, Jesus Christ.
Right. And we're going to discover some other things you found out about him as well. Let me just say, if you've not heard some of these things that Adam's going to share tonight, you may sit there and think, think it through, work it out, and have a good think over some of the things that he's sharing, because they do make a lot of interesting potential in your changing of your understanding of the background of Jesus, not of who Jesus is. If you want to text in and email in while we're going through tonight's show, please do. Your comments, your questions, live at revelationtv.com or 07781 472847. Do that. If we get too many tonight, because sometimes when you deal with a subject like this, you do get quite a few, we'll deal with them next week. So one way or the other, we will make sure we get through everything. And one of the reviews of the book talks about an in-depth, fresh and original look at several first-century manuscripts. Now, that's quite a claim. You know, original and fresh means that A, nobody's done it before, and B, it's new and it's living. Do you think the book really lives up to that?
Yes, because I believe it reveals who Joseph was. And one of the things I could never understand as a Jewish believer in Jesus was why the church in history placed so much emphasis on Jesus' mother Mary and so little emphasis in comparison on his father Joseph, because I understand that in Jewish society the son is raised by the father. Not to say the mother's not important, of course she is, but the person that Jesus would have been known by in his day and age was the son of Joseph. So I decided that I really needed to try and find out who Joseph was, if I could make sense of some of the perceived anomalies in some of the things that the scripture was saying about this man, Jesus. As an apparently uneducated peasant, why did no one ever call him that?
Right.
So I had questions about, well, he's got to be the person that Joseph was in that society. He's the son of Joseph, so I need to understand Joseph if I'm going to understand Jesus. And I don't want to concentrate overly on Mary, pay respect, but try and find out who Joseph was.
It is interesting because, I mean, Joseph goes out of the record fairly early on, doesn't he? And of course, Mary's there right through to the end, so you can understand why people are maybe more interested in Mary. But your belief is that even in that short time, and relatively few scriptures compared with that Joseph is mentioned, if we look at them carefully, we're going to see something different. That maybe this humble carpenter, making tables and chairs and things like that.
Well, we know two things about Joseph from the scripture, but we know things about Joseph from extra scriptural sources, and those are the ancient manuscripts that you were mentioning. So, for example, one of the things we know from church history and the early church chroniclers was that, and from the Bible, was that Joseph had other sons. James was one, for example, a leader of the early church, and he had a title that was given to him by the Jewish community, and it's well known in church tradition, and it's James the Just, a title given to him by Jews. What does that mean, and what does that tell us about who Joseph was, James' father? His actually natural father, not just adoptive in the case of Jesus, but his natural father was someone who could bestow in some way and raise his son to have the title of the Just. That's James. So it's not surprising then that we find Matthew calling Joseph a just or devout or righteous. And that has a very specific meaning in the context of Jewish society.
Because when, I guess if we use the word the just in English, we don't really know what it means. When we start talking about righteous or devout, we get a little more understanding. But if we just take that from our English understanding, would we be anywhere near what the Greek is actually saying and the Jewish tradition comes down to?
We would. Righteousness in that society, which is sort of pre-Pauline, not justice and righteousness by faith, righteousness was from keeping the law. So Paul in Philippians 3 says that he was blameless according to the righteousness that is found in the law. Now, we know that that doesn't save, but in that society, you had to keep the law to be just or to be a devout Jew. That's what it meant. You kept the law, but not just the written law, the law that Moses had handed down, but the oral law as well, the rabbinic law, that made up about 95% of the actual law that people had to keep. And so to be said to be righteous meant that you were keeping that law as well. And that's synonymous with education.
So this idea that Joseph wasn't very well educated, that you get if he's just this humble carpenter, to keep using that phrase, you reckon from just that one scripture is wrong, or would there be other places that you would bring in to underline that?
Well, he certainly had a very esteemed profession, which we can maybe talk about in a few minutes. I mean, the profession of tekton. Tekton's the word we get architect from. So
and that's the word that we get translated carpenter,
yes,
is it? Yes.
So
okay.
The Greek word is tekton. So we need to understand what tektons were in the first century in Judea, because it's very different from our medieval English idea of a woodworker. But to have a son that could be called the Just, and according to Eusebius had priestly privileges, he could go into the temple, into the holy place and pray. If that's true, and that's part of church history, it tells us something about who his father was. And so for Joseph to be called devout is very similar to Luke's description of Joseph of Arimathea, who Luke describes as a council member, a good man, and dikaios. So it's not a description of his character, it's a description of his standing in society in relation to the law. In other words, he kept the law. You couldn't keep the law unless you knew the law. And you couldn't know the law unless you'd sat with the rabbis and been taught it by them, because it was oral. It didn't get written down until 212 AD. And the rabbi said, look, if you want to be righteous, you have to keep God's law. We will teach you God's law, but you've got to spend 8 hours a day. They said there's 8 hours a day for eating and sleeping, 8 hours a day for working, and 8 hours a day for studying Torah. And that's what they did. And that's what you had to do to be able to know the law, to be able to keep the law, to be able to be called righteous according to the law. So it's completely synonymous with being educated from a Jewish perspective.
I mean, this puts a totally different picture, doesn't it, on the Joseph that, you know, they go and, you know, they're so poor they can't go anywhere, they can't find anywhere to sleep and all this, that and the other. This gives a picture of somebody that had a standing in society that was educated.
Indeed.
But then we get to this issue with tekton, which you brought up just then,
Yes.
because if you don't study that word, and we take the English word carpenter, now that just gives us the idea. Here he is in his workshop, you know, and all the pictures of Jesus and his going to visit his father in the workshop, you know, and selling a few tables and making ends meet, you know. You would be saying that tekton is something very different to that. Now, develop that thinking
Absolutely.
as to why.
Now, even in our society, a ship's carpenter is a very different person to a joiner. So in an ocean-going vessel 200 years ago, you had to have a man on board that was capable of putting up a 30-foot mast in a storm to protect the ship. So the ship's carpenter and the skills of the ship's carpenter are completely different in status on board the vessel from a person who could make a table or a chair. But if we go back in Greek literature, we can see in the writings of Homer, someone like Odysseus in Homer's Odyssey was a tekton. Now, what was it that Odysseus made? Well, it was a ship. It wasn't a table. It was an ocean-going vessel.
Right.
So tekton was someone who built a ship. And that implies a high standard of education. But for Joseph, it's even more dramatic than that. Because when he was alive, sort of 20 BC, 25 BC, there was one of the wonders of the world being built in Jerusalem. Much bigger than, say, for example, the Taj Mahal. Much, much bigger. And built at a time when construction didn't have any lifting equipment, didn't have any cranes, etc. But Herod's temple was being built, a sanctuary 165 feet above the ground. Roof beams that were 100 feet long being put in the roof, 165 feet above the ground, no cranes. Now, how was Herod going to do that when the temple was a functioning Jewish temple? Well, there was only one way. He had to train the Jewish priests in the art of the tekton. And that's what Josephus, the main Roman historian from the time, says. He selected 1,000 priests and had them trained in the art of the tekton, because only they could go into the court of the priests, where the sanctuary was, and do the building. No other Jewish person, and certainly no Gentile, could go and build that building 165 feet tall. So it's a bit like saying, well, we've got to rebuild St. Paul's Cathedral, but there's a problem. We can only use Anglican vicars. Yeah. It's a problem. Even if we threw some Baptists in, you know, it would be difficult to do. Yeah. And the problem with the priests in that society, which is even bigger problem than we'd have if we had to use Anglican vicars, they were the elite of Jewish society. They were a higher class within Jewish society, and they kept themselves separate from people who they regarded as unclean or sinners, even Jews that didn't keep the law. They would look down on and be separate from people they regarded as unclean, and so they would have been very difficult to train as builders. Anyway, they wouldn't necessarily have had any aptitude for building, and Herod had to use them to build his temple. To become tektons, to build the temple, requires training, and you can't train someone if they don't respect you or if they won't listen to you. So there's only one class of tekton that could have trained the Jewish priests to be tektons, and that is a devout tekton, one who kept the law, one they would respect as a devout man that they would listen to. And Herod had got 1,000 of these people to train.
Are you going where I think you're going?
Probably.
That Joseph was one of the people that did the training?
Well, let's put it this way. You have to be a Jew to go onto the site. It's a huge building site, 144,000 square feet. Huge building site. To go on that, beyond the outer court, you had to be Jewish. You couldn't go beyond the court of the Gentiles unless you were a Jew. But the problem was that to build the main building, which was 165 feet high, even a non-priest couldn't go there. You had to be a priest. So priests despised people. You can see that from a passage in John 7 where they describe the Jewish worshippers at the Feast of Tabernacles as an accursed mob who do not know the law. They wouldn't talk to them even. They wouldn't come within 6 feet of them. So to train them, you've got to have a Jewish tekton who they respect. And I've studied the period extensively. I've only found one other Jewish scholar who was also a tekton, because scholars had to have day jobs. They couldn't earn their living from teaching Torah. They had to have another job by which they supported themselves. And there's one other rabbi who lived at the time of Joseph who was a tekton. He's called Rabbi Shammai, and he's referred to indirectly in the Gospels as one of the people that put forward a case for divorce. It's Hillel and Shammai. These are the two views that Jesus is asked to choose between about divorce. And he was a tekton. He was a house builder, a construction builder, an architect. So if you've got to train 1,000 priests and about half of them in the art of the tekton, you need as many devout Jewish tektons as you can get. Mm-hmm. Joseph lived at exactly that time. He was from Judea. He fits the bill perfectly. And if he did fulfill that role, it explains a lot of Jesus' references to his father's house. It gives a double meaning to it.
Right. So you you feel that when Jesus said, in my father's house, he could also be referring to Joseph, undoubtedly referring to his father, God the Father.
Absolutely.
But you think he could also be referring?
I think it has to be, because when Jesus said to the Jewish leaders, one greater than the temple is here, that is, on the face of it, a blasphemous statement. He's saying that I'm greater than the temple. I'm here. I'm greater than the temple. The only person greater than the temple is God. So he's telling these Jewish leaders that I am God. But what's missing from that passage? What's missing is the outraged response, the accusation of blasphemy. Why don't they accuse Jesus of blasphemy? Why? Well, you can find the answer in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 3 contains a Jewish proverb which says that the one who builds the house has more honor or is greater than the house. So the architect of a building would have more honor and be greater than the building in that society. So when Jesus says one greater than the temple is here, he's doing two things. He's allying himself to God, but he's not giving them the potential to accuse him of blasphemy, because they know who his father was. His father was the architect, the trainer of the priests who built the temple. So he could, as the firstborn son of that man, legally or adoptively, call himself greater than the temple. But he made many references to his father's house, in fact.
Yes.
And they all make perfect sense if you see Joseph as the architect, the tekton of the temple. And it explains why Jesus went there in Luke 2 when he was lost. Age 12, where did he go? He went to the temple, the place where he was known. Why was he known there? Who looked after him? For 5 days. Yes. And I've lost a child for 5 minutes.
Yeah, you're panicking.
I'm panicking. What was it like to come? What was Joseph experiencing when he was walking around Jerusalem with Mary looking for Jesus? I mean, I was fortunate enough to lose one of my kids in home base when my wife wasn't there. But I can just imagine the ear bashing that I would have got from my wife if she'd been there. Well, what was Joseph experiencing in those 3 days from Mary? He would have been with Joseph, most likely, son and father. Joseph has lost him in the crowd. What's Joseph getting from Mary? And why is it that Jesus says to his parents, why were you searching for me? Didn't you know that I'd be in my father's house?
It's interesting. I mean, I have to say, I've often wondered that, because at that point, there's nothing to even indicate that they knew really who Jesus was. Yes, when at his birth, Mary treasured these things in her heart, but there's nothing we really can understand. And I've often wondered, well, why would... I would have thought that was the last place they'd have expected a 12-year-old boy to go.
Well, you see, what Jesus is doing there is he's brilliantly exhibiting Jewish humour. It's a pun. It's a play on words. And there'd have been a great deal of parental tension and anxiety. And when Joseph heard that, he would have laughed. That was just a fantastic joke. You know, I'm in your house. I'm in the house that you built. Where did you expect me to be? Mm-hmm. I'm certain that Joseph would have laughed. The tension would have been broken, and they would have gone back to Nazareth. But to say that, to find Jesus in this place, is the place where Jesus was known. And the book of Nehemiah tells us that there were many priestly accommodations in the temple, that they had rooms there where they lived. And so Jesus, in fact, says, in my Father's house are many rooms.
Yes.
And it was the true. In the temple, there were many rooms in which the priests that were on duty lived. And we can read about them in the book of Nehemiah. And Jesus, known to the priests as the architect's son, would have been welcomed there. And that explains how he managed to find his way into this hall of study, Bet Midrash, in the temple. They find him not just in the temple, they find him in the place of study with the scholars. How did he get in there? The only way is because they knew his dad.
Yes.
It's the only possible explanation. Why did they admit him? Because they knew his dad. They're looking after him. So there's a connection with the priests through the training of them as the tectons needed to build the temple. But there's another connection, which is through knowing the law. So his father is respected as an architect and as a scholar. So he appeals to both halves of Jewish society, to the priests and to the scholars. It's a fantastic combination. Mary, daughter of Aaron, priestly connections. Joseph, trainer of the priests to build the temple, and a scholar, respected by the men who taught the law. What a connection. Fantastic.
Absolutely. We're only just scratching the surface here, and I think, although we were going to go on to talk about something else next week, I think probably we're going to have to carry this on as we go through. And therefore, we won't sum it up. I mean, one of the things I would want to do at the end of next week is say, OK, Adam, this is all well and good, but, you know, what does it mean to us? But we won't try and do that, you know, today. We'll wait till next week on that one. But are there any other scriptures or anything else concerning Joseph or the way Jesus responds that adds to this, what you've just been saying?
Well, Luke tells us that when they met with Jesus, age 12, they find him with the doctors. And Luke describes the doctors of the law, men like Gamaliel who trained Paul in rabbinic scholarship. He describes their response to Jesus, and the Greek word that Luke uses is egistimi, and it means literally, according to Vine's dictionary, to throw into wonderment. In other words, they were absolutely astonished and amazed, Luke says, at Jesus' understanding and Jesus' answers. So they are over the moon with this star find in Torah. It's a little bit like Alex Ferguson discovering David Beckham. You know, you're not going to let that genius with a football just walk away. You're going to recruit him into your academy in Manchester United because you see in him a great future for the football club. You just don't dismiss a teenage genius with a football in that society where football is so highly prized. And in Jewish first century society, it was Torah that was highly prized, an understanding of Torah. And the doctors of the law, although they don't know it, are meeting with the very person who gave the law to Moses on Mount Sinai. And he is explaining to them things they never understood about Torah. And he is 12 years old. They're thrown into wonderment. Now, those men had a duty to the Jewish community to train up the next generation of temple scholars. And they've got a genius in their midst. Now, what would their reaction have been to that? Psychologically, they're going to want him in their schools. Legally, they're obliged to respond to his level of talent, because the law said that boys had to be trained according to the level of their ability. And Jesus' ability is off the scale, completely off the scale. And so Luke tells us that Jesus, yes, he went back to Nazareth because he hadn't yet finished Talmudic school, which you didn't finish until you were 14. But Luke says something very interesting. He says that Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favour with God and men. I think we sometimes just gloss over these things, but you know, what sort of wisdom was it that Jesus was growing in? It was the wisdom of Torah. And so it's stature in relation to Jewish wisdom. It's stature in relation to the law. In other words, he's going up the rungs in relation to Torah, which is what you would expect a genius to do.
Yeah. We're run out of time for today. We've scratched the surface, Adam. You're looking at scriptures, you're bringing things that we need to look at again. So we'll talk about it again next week. We'll develop it a little bit more. I trust you will take the things you've heard, think about them, work them through in your life. And next week, we'll sum it up. What does it really mean to affect you? Thank you for coming, being with us. See you again next week. Bye.